Steve Harvey had a gift for reading people. In more than a decade of hosting Family Feud, he had stood across from thousands of contestants and learned to see, in the first 30 seconds, exactly what kind of story he was dealing with. The nervous talkers, the overconfident ones who peaked in the warm-up, the quiet grandmothers who turned out to be the sharpest competitors in the room. He had seen them all. What he had not seen, or perhaps had not allowed himself to see, was what walked onto that stage on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2023, in the person of Edward Brooks. Eddie was 61 years old, built wide through the shoulders the way men get when they have spent their working lives using their hands for something real. He had close-cropped gray hair and deep lines around his eyes, the kind that came from years of squinting into the morning sun on long postal routes and, if you looked more carefully, from years of something else entirely. He wore a navy dress shirt with Team Brooks stitched across the pocket in gold thread. His daughter had insisted on that detail. He had let her have it. He stood at the contestants' podium with a stillness that was different from nerves. It was the calm of a man who had been through things that made a game show feel entirely manageable. Beside him in the family lineup stood his daughter Tanya, his son Marcus Jr., his brother Carl, and at the far end, his wife Gloria, 57 years old. A retired elementary school librarian with small gold earrings, and the warm authority of a woman who had spent 30 years managing entire rooms of children with a single look. They had been married 33 years. You could tell that without being told. Not from anything they said, but from the way they stood, close enough to be comfortable, not so close as to need each other for support. The way people stand when the other person's presence has been part of the landscape for so long that their absence would change the shape of everything. Steve Harvey looked at them during the warm-up and thought, these are good people. What he did not know yet was that one of them was carrying a secret. And in about 10 minutes, the whole studio was going to feel the weight of it. Edward James Brooks was born in Gastonia, North Carolina in 1962, the older of two boys raised by their father James, a mechanic, and their mother Frances, who cooked in a school cafeteria for 24 years. James Brooks was a man of very few words and very large presence, the kind of father who taught by doing rather than telling, who expressed love through specific, deliberate acts rather than declarations, and who believed that what a man built with his hands said more about his character than anything he could say out loud. When Eddie was 16, his father brought home a 1967 Ford Mustang in pieces. It was not a romantic moment. It was a rusted, half-dismantled wreck that James had bought for $200 from a man who had given up on it. The engine was seized. The interior was stripped to bare metal. One door was held on by wire. James set it in the driveway, handed his son a wrench, and said, "We're going to fix this." It took them 11 years. Not continuously. Life interrupted constantly. Eddie graduated high school, joined the United States Postal Service, worked overtime, got married, had children. His father put in long hours at the garage, but on weekends, and on slow evenings, and on the Saturday mornings when the light came through the garage door at exactly the right angle, they worked on that car together. They sourced parts from junkyards 3 states away. They rebuilt the engine by hand. They taught Eddie's son Marcus Jr. to sand properly by the time he was old enough to hold a sanding block. James Brooks never said "I love you" easily. But every hour he spent in that garage with his son was the same thing said in a language they both understood completely. James Brooks died in 2009. He did not quite live to see the Mustang finished. The final coat of paint, deep metallic blue, the color James had always wanted, went on in the spring of 2010. Eddie sat in the driver's seat for a long time after Carl took the last photograph, and nobody said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The car became the most prized thing Eddie owned, not for what it was worth, which was considerable, but for what it meant. It was the last thing he and his father had built together. It was 11 years of love expressed in engine grease and worn sandpaper and Saturday mornings. He drove it on Sundays. He kept it in a temperature-controlled garage. He cleaned it himself, by hand, never took it anywhere else. His daughter Tanya had grown up treating the Mustang like a family member. His wife Gloria used to joke that the car ranked above her in the household priorities. And Eddie would smile and not entirely deny it, and she would laugh because she had known exactly who she was marrying when she married him. Gloria Mae Simmons had grown up in Charlotte, the only daughter of Ruth and Thomas Simmons. Thomas had died when Gloria was 29, a heart attack on a Tuesday morning that had rearranged everything the family understood about how quickly the world could change. After that, it had been Gloria and her mother, Miss Ruth, as close as two people could be without living under the same roof. Miss Ruth was the woman who had taught Gloria to read before kindergarten, who had attended every school event and every graduation and every important day. She was the kind of mother who made her children feel that being loved by her was simply the baseline condition of the world. 14 months ago, Miss Ruth had stopped recognizing her daughter's face. Alzheimer's. Early onset of the moderate stage, progressing faster than the doctors had initially projected. Miss Ruth was now 82 and living in a memory care facility in Charlotte called Magnolia Gardens. It was a good facility, the best in the county by any measure. It had a real garden that residents could walk through every morning. It had music therapy 3 times a week, and individual care plans, and a ratio of caregivers to residents that meant someone always had eyes on Miss Ruth. It had a dining room with fresh flowers on the tables and windows that let in the morning light in long, warm rectangles across the floor. What it did not have was any coverage under Gloria's insurance plan, which classified it as elective premium care and covered only a basic tier facility across town that was adequate and nothing more. Gloria knew about the insurance gap. She believed it was being covered by a church fundraiser and community contributions. She was wrong. What was actually covering the difference, the full gap between what insurance paid and what Magnolia Gardens cost, was a single payment made 14 months ago by her husband. The payment had come from the sale of a 1967 Ford Mustang in deep metallic blue, a car in immaculate condition that a collector in Raleigh had paid full market value for within 48 hours of the listing going up. Carl had driven the car to Raleigh and handed over the keys and driven back to Charlotte in silence, and had not said one word to anyone except his brother. The church fundraiser was real. Eddie had quietly asked the pastor to organize it, so there would be something visible for Gloria to point to. But the fundraiser had raised just under $8,000. Eddie had made up the remaining $41,000 from the sale of the only thing his father had ever left him. Gloria did not know. Eddie had not told her because he knew his wife completely. He knew that if she found out, she would feel responsible. She would feel guilty. She would insist on finding another way, on sacrificing something herself, on refusing to let him carry it alone. He had not wanted her to do any of that. He had wanted her to be able to visit her mother in that garden, to watch Miss Ruth sit in the morning light and listen to music, to know that she was somewhere beautiful, without ever having to carry the cost of it. He had kept the secret for 14 months, and then Steve Harvey asked him how things were going at home. The pre-game conversation with the Brooks family started the way it always started, Steve working his way down the lineup, asking questions, drawing people out, looking for the story that was always somewhere inside every family if you asked the right thing at the right moment. Tanya told him about her job as a physical therapist, which Steve turned into a joke about needing one after filming. Marcus Jr. mentioned he was an electrician, and Steve pretended to be afraid of him. Carl said he had been trying to learn to cook at 55, and Steve spent 60 seconds making that funnier than it had any right to be. And then he got to Eddie. "Eddie," Steve said, settling in. "Tell me what's been going on with you, brother. What does life look like for you right now?" Eddie smiled. It was a careful smile, retired now. 32 years with the Postal Service, so I'm enjoying the slower pace. 32 years. Steve nodded with real respect. "Brother, that is a career. That's not a job, that is a career." He paused. "And how's everything at home? Family doing all right?" Something moved through Eddie's face, small enough that most people would have missed it entirely. Steve Harvey did not miss it. "We've had some challenges," Eddie said. "What kind of challenges?" On Eddie's right side, Gloria was watching her husband with a soft, familiar expression, the expression of a woman ready to help if he needed an easier way through the answer. She had said these words before, in this order, to people who asked. "Gloria's mother," Eddie said. He said it quietly, The way you say the name of something that costs you something to touch. Miss Ruth, diagnosed with Alzheimer's about a year and a half ago. It's moved pretty fast. The studio audience shifted from warmth to stillness. Everyone in a room that size knows someone. Everyone knows what that word takes from a family. I'm sorry to hear that, Steve said, and he meant it the direct way people mean things when they have stopped performing. How is she doing? She's doing well, Eddie said. She's in a good place. A real good place. Something thickened slightly in those last words. A real good place, and his gaze dropped for just a moment before coming back up. Steve noticed it. Tell me what you mean by that, he said. Tell me about that. Eddie's jaw shifted slightly. Down the lineup, Carl had gone perfectly still. There's a facility called Magnolia Gardens, Eddie said, choosing each word carefully, the way you do when you are aware that you are close to a line. It's the best memory care facility in our area. Real garden, music therapy. The staff knows Miss Ruth by name. They know her schedule, what she likes in the morning, what music she responds to. He paused. When we found out how fast her condition was moving, I knew that was where she needed to be. And she's been there how long? 14 months. Steve nodded, watching him. And how did you make that work, Eddie? Because I know those kinds of facilities, quality care like that comes with real costs. The studio was very quiet. Tanya had gone still in the same way Carl had. Gloria was watching her husband with the gentle expression of someone who has heard this story and is grateful for the ending. She had not heard this version. Eddie looked at Steve Harvey for a moment. Something in the way Steve was watching him, patient, unhurried, genuinely waiting, made 14 months of carefully maintained silence finally give way. I sold my car, Eddie said. Gloria turned. My father and I built a '67 Mustang together, Eddie continued, and his voice was completely level, the way a man sounds when he made his decision long ago and has nothing left to second guess. Took us 11 years. My father passed before we got to finish it. I put the last coat of paint on in his memory and drove that car for 15 years. He stopped briefly. I sold it 14 months ago to cover the cost of Miss Ruth's facility. Our insurance doesn't cover the level of care she needs, and I didn't want, his voice dropped half a register, I didn't want Gloria to carry that on top of everything else she was already carrying. The studio was absolutely silent. Gloria Brooks had not moved. She was standing at the podium with her hand over her mouth and her eyes fixed on her husband's face. She was looking at him as if she was seeing something she had looked at every day for 33 years and was only now understanding in full. Eddie, she said. It was barely sound at all. The car is just a car, he said. He turned and looked at her directly. Miss Ruth is your mother. There was no decision to make. Something passed through the studio audience, a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence, but something in between. 200 people all arriving at the same understanding at the same time. And then Gloria Brooks stepped back from the podium. She walked to the side of the stage, and she was gone. For about 4 seconds, the studio did not know what to do with itself. Steve Harvey had hosted more episodes of Family Feud than he could count. He had seen contestants faint and argue and freeze completely, and once, memorably, begin celebrating before the points were even confirmed. He had never seen a woman simply leave the stage. He looked at Eddie. Eddie looked at him. The expression on Eddie's face was not surprise. It was the expression of a man who knows his wife. She needs a minute, Eddie said quietly. Steve Harvey turned to the audience, raised one hand for patience, and walked to the side of the stage. Gloria Brooks was standing just off camera with her back to the studio, one hand pressed flat against the wall as if she needed something solid to hold herself upright. Her shoulders were shaking in the small, controlled way of someone crying without wanting to be heard. Steve stood beside her. He did not immediately say anything. He had learned over a very long career that some moments needed to breathe before they could be spoken to. After a moment, Gloria turned to look at him. Her face was wet, and her mascara was gone, and she did not seem to be aware of either thing. He sold his father's car, she said. Not a question, not an accusation. A woman saying something out loud because saying it was the only way to understand that it was real. Yes, ma'am, Steve said. He loved that car. She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes. His father died before they finished it. They spent 11 years building it together. He kept it in a special garage. He cleaned it himself. He never let anyone else. She stopped. She shook her head. He sold his father's car so my mother could sit in a garden. Yes, ma'am, Steve said. That is exactly what he did. Gloria looked at him with the expression of someone whose understanding of something has just been completely confirmed and is too large to fit into ordinary emotion. How long have you known? She asked. About 12 minutes, Steve said honestly. She laughed. Sudden and genuine, and completely wet, and Steve Harvey felt the tension of the moment open into something warmer and more manageable. He took a breath. Gloria, he said, and now he was speaking directly, without performance. I want to tell you something. In all my years on this stage, I have talked to a lot of couples. I have heard every version of what a marriage can look like. And what that man just told me, he didn't do it to look good. He wasn't planning to tell you. He told me because I asked how things were, and 14 months of carrying it alone was finally enough. He paused. What Eddie did is not something most people are capable of. He gave up his last connection to his father, not just a car, the last thing his daddy's hands touched. And he did it so your mother could have flowers on her table and music in her mornings, and people who know her name. Steve stopped. He did it so you could visit her without carrying the weight of the cost. Every single day for 14 months, he made that choice, and he didn't ask for anything back. Gloria's chin was trembling. That is not a gesture, Steve said quietly. That is 33 years of a man deciding, every single morning, that your peace matters more than his. He walked her back to the stage. The studio was on its feet before she reached the podium. She crossed back to stand beside her husband, and the moment she was close enough, Eddie opened his arm and she stepped into his side without any discussion. The way people do when they have been fitting into the same space for decades, and the motion is as natural as breathing. She looked up at him. Why didn't you tell me? She said. You would have told me not to, he said. You're right, she said. She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. I would have. She pulled back and looked at him. Thank you. Steve Harvey turned to the studio and the cameras and spoke quietly and directly. We talk about love all the time, he said. We put it in songs and celebrate it on anniversaries. But what Eddie Brooks did, that is what love looks like when it is not performing. When nobody is watching. When the only audience is yourself and the choice that is in front of you. He paused. He chose his wife's mother. He chose his wife's peace. He chose that every morning for 14 months, and he never once asked for credit. He shook his head slowly. That is not a grand gesture. That is a man's character. And his character is beautiful. The Brooks family won their episode. It was not particularly close. Gloria, once she returned to the podium, played with the calm precision of a woman who has just had her entire interior rearranged and has decided to channel all of it into focus. She answered cleanly, steadily, without hesitation. The audience cheered everything she did. When the episode aired, the 2-minute clip of Eddie's admission and Gloria's walk-off and Steve Harvey's words at the side of the stage was online within hours of broadcast. By the end of 48 hours, it had been viewed 18 million times. Within 10 days, the number crossed 50 million. The comments were unlike anything the show's social team had encountered before. Not quick reactions, but long, carefully written paragraphs from people telling their own stories. A man from Ohio who had sold his record collection to pay for his wife's physical therapy and never told her. A woman from Georgia who had found receipts after her husband passed and spent an afternoon crying in her kitchen, understanding what he had quietly done. Hundreds of people writing about the sacrifices inside their own marriages, the things done in the dark for someone else's light that they had never talked about, because that was not why they had done them. Several grief counselors posted the clip with notes explaining its value for clients learning to recognize love that expressed itself through action rather than words. Social workers in elder care shared it specifically for families navigating the financial weight of memory care, which was often the thing families discussed least honestly and suffered most quietly. Steve Harvey brought Eddie and Gloria back to his talk show the following month. For 20 minutes, the three of them talked about marriage and sacrifice, and the specific quality of grief that comes from losing a parent to Alzheimer's while that parent is still alive, which is one of the things the disease does that people rarely prepare for. The talk show audience sat in the unusual quiet of people who are listening rather than reacting. "Do you regret not telling her sooner?" Steve asked Eddie. Eddie thought about it genuinely. "No," he said, "because every day she could visit her mother without worrying about the cost was a day I gave her. I don't regret a single one of those days." Gloria, beside him, looked at the floor and then back up. "He could have told me," she said. "You would have said no," Eddie said. "I would have said no," she agreed. A pause. "He knows me." What followed in the months after the episode was slow and generous. A car collector from Memphis, a man in his 70s who had watched the episode 4 times, tracked down the Raleigh buyer through collector networks. The buyer had not sold the Mustang. He had held on to it, he said, because something about the listing had felt significant, though he could not articulate exactly what. When the collector explained whose car it was and what building it had cost and what selling it had meant, the buyer called Eddie directly. The call lasted 11 minutes. At the end of it, a price was agreed. The buyer refused to make a profit on it. The 1967 Ford Mustang in deep metallic blue came back to Charlotte 6 weeks after the episode aired. Eddie drove it into the garage himself and sat in it alone for a while before he told anyone. Carl found out by text message and sat in a grocery store parking lot for 10 minutes composing himself before he could drive. The car was not the point. Eddie would say that plainly and mean it. He had sold it without hesitation and would sell it again if the situation required. But its return was a kind of grace note, unexpected, unearned, generous in the way that things sometimes are when a story has been told honestly. Miss Ruth remained at Magnolia Gardens. She had good days and harder days, the way Alzheimer's works. On the good days, she sometimes knew Gloria's name. On all days, she sat in the garden when the weather permitted. The staff said she liked mornings especially, when the light came through the rose beds at a low angle and the birds were loudest. Gloria visited every other day. She always brought something small, a photograph, a flower from her own garden, a song she would hum sitting close to her mother's chair. She had never carried the financial weight of the facility, because her husband had removed it from her before she could pick it up. She knew that now, and knowing did not diminish the gift. It made it larger. When people asked Gloria what she had taken from all of it, the episode, the revelation, the strange public unfolding of something that had been private for so long, she said the same thing every time. "I already knew I had a good husband," she said. "I just didn't know how good." A year after the episode aired, Tanya started a small nonprofit in Charlotte focused on helping families bridge the financial gap of memory care for aging parents. She named it the Garden Fund, after the garden at Magnolia Gardens where her grandmother sat in the mornings. In its first year, it helped 11 families keep their loved ones in quality care their insurance would not cover. Steve Harvey, when he heard about the fund, made 2 calls. The fund's budget doubled in its second year. In her thank you letter to him, Tanya wrote, "My father taught me that love is what you do when no one is watching. You taught us that when it finally comes to light, it can do more for more people than one family ever imagined." Steve kept the letter. He put it near the bangle that Priya Chandri had given him years before, and sometimes he looked at both of them and thought about what they had in common, about the specific things that ordinary people carry without announcement, and about what happens when the right question, asked quietly at the right moment, finally brings them into the light. In his autobiography, years later, he would write that the best moments of his career were never the ones he had planned. They were always the ones where he had set the punchline down and simply asked, "What happened?" and stayed quiet long enough to hear what came back.